Lately, I've been wrestling with a choice that I have to make about the way that I understand my children. They are either psychotic or they understand something about something that I don't. Here's what I mean. No matter how many times and in no matter what ways my children injure themselves, the remedy is always the same. A Band-Aid. The presence of blood or lack thereof is completely irrelevant. I don't understand how this works. If they bump into somebody, they want a Band-Aid. If they get their feelings hurt, they want a Band-Aid. If they didn't get a snack, they want a Band-Aid. It doesn't matter what's going on for them, they want a Band-Aid. And it's amazing how as soon as that Band-Aid is applied to their skin, anywhere, everything is better. It never, ever fails. Band-Aids just make things better. And that's true physically, right? If we get a cut or something like that, we put a Band-Aid on it with maybe some Neosporin, and it does. It does its job. It makes things physically better, but I'm learning through my children that a Band-Aid actually does more. There's something to it that's mental. It's a psychological thing, whether that's like the placebo effect or whatever you want to call it. There's something mentally healing for my kids in just simply having a Band-Aid applied. There's something emotionally healing. I don't know how it works, but usually if there are tears, they stop once the Band-Aid arrives because they know they're better. But I'm also learning that a Band-Aid is best applied in the context of width. Have you ever tried to put a Band-Aid on by yourself? It is not easy, and it's one of the most frustrating things for a child to do. And so they have their mother or their father help them put the Band-Aid on, and you know how this goes. The Band-Aid gets put on, and while it's being applied, the mother or the father is going, "It's going to be okay, you're strong, right? This is how it works." And you take all of those things and you mix them together and you stumble onto something that I think is really important for you and I to understand about our healing. Whether that's emotional healing or physical healing or spiritual healing or mental healing, I think it happens best in the context of width. Because community, what we've been talking about for the last several weeks, is more than just warm fuzzies. It's more than just the thing that we do because that's what church people do. They get together and have groups. It's more than that. Just like a Band-Aid is more than that, and it does more for us than just give us some friends. It actually helps us heal and puts us back together. I love this quote from a Christian psychologist. Her name is Margaret Rink. And she says this about the church: to help people recover from sin and failure's wounds, we need to create a healing community, a place where it's acceptable to be broken, have problems, admit failure, and where help is expressed in concrete, practical ways. I love that picture of the church. I love this idea that people could come to a community and they can come with all of their mess and all of their ick. Just like a kid who gets hurt does not think, "I need to clean up this blood or this cut or this scrape before I go to get my healing from my mom or my dad or the Band-Aid." They go with all of it because they go for that purpose. So I don't know how it got backwards where some of us have thought, I've got to get my act put together before I go to church and before I connect with Christians. This is supposed to be the very thing that helps us get put back together. So I'm going to give away the sermon in the first 5 minutes, but we need to have an agreement that you're going to listen the rest of the way. But if it gets twisted and weird as we go, this is what I want you to understand today. And for all of you English and grammar teachers out there, my apologies. But here's what I believe with all my heart. God puts together we to put together me. God puts together we to put together me. That people and community coming together is one of the ways that God uses to put me whole again, to help me heal. And it's an amazing privilege that He invites us into this process. But we can't miss the important ingredient that is life together when it comes to all of the different ways that we know we need to get better. And there's no greater example for me in all of the scriptures of this happening in living color than at Paul's conversion. If you aren't familiar with Paul, he wrote most of the New Testament. His name used to be Saul, and he was a bad man. And I want to examine just a little bit about the moment that he became a Christian, but even more so the moments around that moment that he became a Christian, because God does a pretty unique and incredible thing in the way that He helps Paul heal spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally, all of those kinds of things. So if you want to follow along, we're going to be in the book of Acts again today. We're going to be in chapter 9. So if you know from now on, if you ever need to read about when Paul became a Christian, it is in Acts chapter 9. And Acts chapter 9 is kind of this turning point. Luke wrote Acts, and up until this point, he's talked a lot about Peter and the church in Jerusalem. And in Acts 9, he starts to focus on Paul, and we get his story kind of the rest of the way. And what's really cool to do is you follow his journeys throughout the rest of Acts, and you can take the letters that he wrote and you can apply them into that story and kind of read those letters as you get to the places that Paul got, and it's a really, really cool way that God put the whole thing together. But we're going to sit in Acts chapter 9 for most of our time together this morning because it's an amazing thing that takes place. I want to start right in verse 2 of chapter 9. Saul requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus, asking for their cooperation in the arrest of any followers of the way. Now, this is a word or a phrase that is only really appears in scriptures and usually by Paul and with regard to the first century church. The way is what they called Christians before they called them Christians. Christians was actually a derogatory term. It was people making fun of people trying to be little Christs. That's how they would have said it. So Jesus comes along and he starts this movement that they refer to as the way of Jesus of Nazareth. And so that's what we're talking about here. Paul, who is formerly Saul, is bent on snuffing out the way. He is a good Jew. He's a Pharisee. He's well-trained, and he sees it as his job to snuff out the way. So he goes and he gets papers, and then we read on in the next verse. He wanted to bring them, both men and women. Now, I don't want to miss this. This just points to how intense this dude is. Most of the time, if you're trying to make a point by harming people or imprisoning people, you just take care of the guys. Right? You know, in scriptures, most of the time they counted only the men. It was like a big deal to be a guy back then. And so if you were going to do harm to people so that they'd stop believing a certain thing, you'd go after the men. Not Saul. Saul's like, no, we're going after them all. We're going to get the men and the women, and then I'm going to drag them from Damascus back down to Jerusalem, which is about a 200-plus mile journey. Because Saul's idea is, I am going to embarrass them. I'm going to make them feel shame. And then for the people that walk and that stand on the side of the street and watch the parade of captured Christians walk by, they're going to go, I don't want to be in those chains. So I'm done with the way. You see, Saul knew he could intimidate Christians away. He was not a nice person, and I think sometimes we have a tendency, or I do at least, I sugarcoat his life before the moment we're about to arrive at. But Paul was responsible, and we're going to hear this from his own mouth in a little bit later. He was responsible for the death of countless Christians. And then, on his way to Damascus, something interesting happens. As he was approaching Damascus on this mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. And if you keep reading into the next couple verses, you're going to realize that Jesus himself meets Paul. He decides, well, he's still Saul, but Jesus decides we're going to have the most vivid come to Jesus meeting that's ever been had. And he appears before Saul on this road to Damascus. He says, "Why are you persecuting me?" You can read the rest of that story this afternoon. But like I said, what I want to examine is the moments that kind of happen around this. Particularly this idea that Paul is approaching Damascus. This is super, super important because it's on the road that Paul finds divinity. It's in the city, though, that he finds community. Because if you jump ahead to verse 10, this is what you read. There was a believer in Damascus named Ananias. So if you can imagine a map, Saul is making his way towards Damascus up from Jerusalem. And all the time there's this like homing beacon in that city. This guy named Ananias, this Christian named Ananias. And you start to realize, oh, there's a bigger story here. That God is going to do something by bringing two people together. It's what I call, and several people call, a providential relationship. It's God using a relationship between two people to bring them closer to Him. It's an amazing thing that He does. Now, you understand the word relationship. We understand that by definition, means with. It's got to be more than one person. But this idea of providential is huge for you and I to understand. Because we shouldn't just blindly go through our life assuming that every relationship we have is just circumstance. There might be a bigger story at play. Here's what providential means. There's two definitions that I want us to look at. The first is occurring at a favorable or opportune time. It just so happens that there's a guy named Ananias and a guy named Saul heading to the same city at the same time around the same circumstances. And again, we have a tendency to go, isn't that a cool coincidence? And God goes, that is my specialty. Because the other definition of providential goes like this, involving divine foresight or intervention. I think what we're going to see is that God is so blatant in bringing these two guys together that you almost have to giggle. Because Jesus meets him on the road, and one of the first things he says is, go to Damascus. And we learn that at a certain point, Paul actually has a vision of this guy named Ananias coming to meet him. God is so intense about this that he actually pays a visit to Ananias too. In a vision, this is what he says to Ananias, Acts chapter 9, verse 11. The Lord said, go over to Straight Street. I just think this is God's sense of humor. There is a real place called Straight Street in Damascus. Go over to Straight Street because I just scared this dude straight. To the house of Judas. When you get there, ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. And right about there, Ananias went, oh. Did you just say what I think you said? Because that name would have sent shivers down the spine of any Christian that heard it. This is the guy on a mission to kill me. And you want me to go over and talk with him? And this is the reply. This is what Ananias says. He's praying. Jesus says, he's praying to me right now. I've shown him a vision of a man named Ananias coming in and laying hands on him so he can see again. Now, I find that really fascinating that God says, I've shown him that you're coming, and I want you to know why I'm sending you. Again, we love the idea of why. Why is this happening? Why do I need to do this? Why am I being asked to participate in this way? And God comes right out and says to Ananias, I'm sending you over to him so that he can see again. Isn't it interesting that God doesn't say, I'm sending you over to him so that he could have a friend? He doesn't send him to him so that Saul wouldn't think he's alone in the world. He didn't send him over to him so that Saul could go, oh, there's nice Christians. He says specifically, I'm sending Ananias to see Saul so that Saul can see, period. That Ananias is going to play some part in the healing of Saul, the putting back together of Saul. So this blatant bringing together that God is doing of these two people in this city called Damascus just reminds me that God puts together we to put together me. That God puts together we so that I can be put back together, right? He understands that Saul he's broken. And if anybody had failures, it's Saul. And so he's there, and God goes, I'm going to use a relationship to help put him back together, and not just the warm fuzzy, but this hyper practical help. That Ananias is going to show up and lay hands on Saul, and Saul will be able to see again. Now, if you fast forward several chapters into Acts, and you get to this place where Saul is giving, well, now Paul, he's giving an account of his conversion, an account of these events. So what we're about to read in Acts chapter 22 comes from Paul's mouth himself. It's his description of what happened. This is how it reads, Acts chapter 22, verse 12. He, being Ananias, came and stood beside me, being Paul, and said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. And that very moment I could see him. So you see the physical healing that happens here. Ananias walks up, Brother Saul, receive your sight, get it back, be put back together, be healed. Boom, it happens. Now, let's make sure we're all on the same page. God healed Paul. He uses Ananias to do so. That's really important. But sometimes we use that as the opportunity to dismiss our part in what God's doing. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But I want you to see the full orb of what God gives Paul in this moment, because it goes way beyond sight. It's just like the Band-Aid. It's more than the physical that happens. Paul goes on to say this. Then he told me, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and hear him speak. Now, what God is doing right here is he's going to work on Paul's mind. I believe that what we're seeing here is God saying, I'm going to heal you mentally. You're going to think differently about me, about Christians, about the Jews, about the world. I am totally going to revolutionize the way your brain processes everything. So he's not just getting healed physically, I think he's getting healed mentally, but that's not where it stops either. We read on. For you are to be his witness, telling everyone what you have seen and heard. Everyone, not some, not the people who don't know who you are. Everyone. So these missions that you've been on to snuff out the way, I'm going to send you on new missions to the same people to tell them that the way is the way. Can you imagine what's going through everybody's mind at this moment? Wait a minute, I'm going to go from killing Christians and imprisoning Christians and approving when Stephen was stoned to death, and now I'm going to go tell people I was wrong? And then if Ananias was getting in on any of this, he's probably going, really? God, that's going to be some trick. But what I think is what we're seeing is that Paul's being healed socially too. Think of all the broken relationships that he has. He's this hyper-zealous, intense guy, and I'm nervous to meet Paul one day. I just think he's gonna get at me. That's why I always want to go to Peter, because we're similar. Paul's gonna be like, man, what in the world were you doing? But God's going to take those relationships and he's going to put them back together as Paul heads out on missionary journey after missionary journey after missionary journey. And then the best comes last. The most important part, the part that feeds all the rest of it, is what is talked about here. What are you waiting for? Get up and be baptized. Have your sins washed away by calling on the name of the Lord. What happens here is that Saul, now Paul, is healed spiritually. And I'm reading through this week and I'm going, wow, God did something far bigger than just made a guy be able to see again. Some people would argue that there's a Band-Aid effect here, that more is happening than just this. We tend to focus on the physical part of it, but there's more to it than that. And all of it happens in the context of this relationship between Paul and Ananias. You see, God puts together we to put together me. I've experienced this in my own life. The broken parts that I bring into the relationships have been healed and ministered to by other people in the relationships. The more I stay isolated, the more it festers. The more I stay by myself, the more I get of what I've already got. But as God brings more and more people into my life that have surrounded me and loved me and cared for me, I experience deep healing. There's actually one more form of healing that I think God gives Saul. And again, if you jump a few chapters ahead to chapter 26 in Acts, and again, what we're about to read is from Paul's own mouth, a description of who he was before he met Jesus on the road and then went on to have this community with Ananias. Listen to what he says. I caused many believers to be sent to prison. Not I approved, not I stood idly by, I caused. I sent them there. And I cast my vote against them when they were condemned to death. Many times I had them punished in the synagogues to get them to curse Jesus. I was so violently opposed to them that I even chased them down in foreign cities. You understand, Paul is Darth Vader. He was a bad dude, and he was just after Christians. Violently. I mean, think about the condition of his heart and how he lived every day, and the anger that was just pulsating through his body that he had justified for religious reasons. But then Jesus meets him on the road, turns his world upside down. He gets together with Ananias. Ananias puts his hands on him, and all of a sudden, Paul experiences more, and he also experiences emotional healing. Think about this. Emotionally, Paul goes from anger, violence, hatred, to being filled with the Spirit, which means he begins to experience the fruit of the Spirit, which is the opposite of violence, anger, and hatred. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. God does an unbelievable miracle in the heart of this man. You see, what happens is Paul is healed emotionally, and when his sins are washed away, he's healed spiritually. And again, this should probably be listed first because it feeds into all of the other things. It's the most important part of his conversion. But what I want you to see is that it's more than that. It feeds into every part of who he was, because he's also healed socially. Some of the people that in Paul's letters he thanks and he says that he loves and that they're a part of his ministry, they're the same people that were terrified of him just a few years before. God does this miracle in his life. He also heals him mentally. Paul thinks differently. He sees the world differently. And of course, he's healed physically. He can see again. It's interesting when we read words like, I once was blind, but now I see. Paul understood that in such a deeply profound way. And what most people would say is if you have these 5 elements represented in someone being put back together, someone being healed, you have what's called holistic healing. And sometimes when we hear that, we think of, magic potions and oils and herbs and spices. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the comprehensive person. All of who Saul is healed in this moment. Every component of what makes him him is touched by the healing hand of God through the hand of Ananias, which leads me to the big question here. Why? Why Ananias? Why a person at all? Have you ever thought about this? When we were reading this, did you go, did I miss something? Isn't God God? And wasn't that Jesus on the road? And couldn't Jesus have touched Paul? Couldn't Jesus have said, receive your sight? And delivered this message that Ananias delivered? I mean, it could have just been Jesus. End of story. Paul stands up, tells his boys, hey, we got a new mission, let's go. But instead, God goes to all this trouble of involving another person. We should never overlook that. We should never just breeze through the fact that God's God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, wherever he wants, and yet he lets people in on it. He goes to Ananias and says, head over to Straight Street. I got a guy you need to meet. And you're going to play an important part in an important guy's life. He's going to help launch this church thing, and you're going to be in on the very ground level of that. It's interesting that not long after this, Paul heads to a town called Corinth, and later on writes a couple letters back to the Christians in that city. And in one, we call it 2 Corinthians, he writes these words: all this newness of life, or all this healing, all this putting back together is from God, who brought us back to himself through what Christ did. And God has given us the task of reconciling people to him. The answer to the question of why does God involve people is I don't know. But he does it. And Paul says, listen, you get to be a part of what God's doing in this world. The reconciliation, the bringing back together, the newness of life, the healing of the world. You get to play a part of that in the context of doing life together. It's not by accident that Ananias happened to be in the city that Saul was traveling to. It's not by accident that randomly, think about it from Saul's perspective or anybody else's perspective that's living on Straight Street, where all of a sudden this guy named Ananias shows up and goes, is Saul from Tarsus here? It's not accidental. It's very on purpose. So even though God doesn't need us to do what he does, he uses us to do what he does. And what I want us to understand, because I've had to understand this a lot lately, is that God uses us in ways that are bigger and better and more than just passive conduit. That we're actually an active ingredient in God's process of reaching people and healing people and ministering to people and loving people. You see, sometimes what I've done in my life is I think of myself as just this conduit, and God just runs through me, and that's true. I'm not saying it's not true. That's a part of it. But we think then that we aren't important, and obviously there's something to it beyond just that. Because why did he send Ananias? So that Saul could receive his sight. It was bigger than he just needed a friend. It was bigger than he just needed somebody to tell Saul more about Jesus and about being baptized and all that stuff. That Ananias played an important part. It was the laying on of his hands that, yes, God worked through, but that was a part of it that can't be ignored. And why that's so important for me and for us to understand is that you and I are a huge part of what God's trying to do in you and I. That he uses us He doesn't need us, but he uses us. And what a privilege. I love this quote by Paul Tripp. He's one of my favorite Christian authors. He says, "Our lives were designed to be community projects." Our lives were not meant to be a solo act. We say this all the time. Life is better connected, we grow more in a circle, not a row. We say all these things. But the truth is, one of the primary ways that God grows our faith, one of the primary ways that God ministers to us is through providential relationships, through community. And we begin to experience some wholeness because they've been introduced into our story. And I don't want anybody walking out of here misunderstanding what I'm saying. What I'm not saying is that there's never a time where we need some professional help or medicine or those kinds of things. What I am saying is that we all walk around every single day with parts of us that are broken. We all walk around every single day with failure and shame and guilt and all of those kinds of things. And we sometimes wonder, why doesn't God help? And yet we don't pick up the phone when someone calls. And we hide behind the couch when the doorbell rings. Or we fail to get involved in a community group. What if those are some of the ways that God's been trying to enter into your story and bring some wholeness again? What if God really does put together we to put together me? What if it's about bringing some people together? And remember, we've been talking about Paul, like the super Christian. And he needed other people. You read about his story. We talked about this last week. It's always Paul and somebody, whether it's Silas or Timothy or Barnabas or Ananias at the very beginning. God's always bringing people together. The challenge for you and I, though, is that we have to take what's the first step in recovery and healing of any kind. Admit you've got a problem. I have to admit that I am not whole, that I have broken parts of me, and that I need to experience God's healing in my life in certain ways. And for some of us, we've taken a step towards that, but we've failed to do it out loud. And some of us need to just say, I know I have a problem, and I need help. You may need to send up a flare. Just telling everybody, listen, I'm out here alone. And I don't know how to navigate all this by myself. I need somebody to meet me on Straight Street so that God can use them to help me find the healing that I'm so desperate for, whether that's spiritual, emotional, mental, physical, social. I think God uses people to encourage us and to build us up. And I shouldn't even say I know. Because it's everywhere in the scriptures and it's been the experience of my life. So here's what's so cool is you and I look at what we regularly refer to as a broken world, a fallen world. We begin to understand that God has positioned the church in a very unique position, in that he's equipped us with all kinds of community and relationship that I think rightly applied helps bring healing to that broken, sick world. You see, the church and community is more. It's not just something that helps us feel better, it actually makes us better. And not because community alone is the silver bullet. It's because God is in it and he uses it. It's not a nice thing to call someone a tool, but I think we are God's tools. We are his equipment that he uses to accomplish incredible things. And he uses community. Sometimes we overthink it. What if it's as simple as the people in your life who you know are hurting and broken, inviting them into a relationship and saying, I'm here for you. Some of us are sitting here every day, all day, and we're feeling like my faith is not coming alive. I don't see it making any difference. I'm showing up to church and I'm doing all the kinds of things, but I'm doing it alone, and maybe a light bulb's going off today, like, I shouldn't be doing this alone. There's power in the word with. There's power in the idea of life together. That sometimes in that context, the most broken parts of us, God starts to put back together. And one of the places for me, one of the environments in which I've experienced this power comes in the context of what we call Vantage Point 3. It's a 9-month journey, and that is the absolute best word to describe it. It's a journey with others. And you spend time understanding who's God, who did he make me to be, and how is he going to use me in my world and in his world and the story that he's writing. And I want to encourage you to consider that maybe in that, like it was for me, you will find some of God's healing touch, where you take some of your past and you start to see God's fingerprints in it. And you start to look into the future a little bit and go, I see God's fingerprints in it. But the best way to describe it is from the lips of people who have experienced it. So will you just take a few minutes and watch this video?
One of the ways at Emmanuel that we help people understand just what kind of masterpiece they are and what ways that God has prepared for them to walk in is Vantage Point 3. Vantage Point 3 is a pathway of 3 8 to 9 month processes that are essentially a long walk with a small group of people surrounded by questions to help them grow to be like Jesus.
I would describe Way of Life as a journey of self-exploration and understanding of God, His people, and this world.
Walking with Others is a group of people that get together that want to study God's Word. We get an opportunity to pray together, eat together, and what's most important, I think, is that we grow together as we learn God's Word. It's interesting to see how we become a little community and reach out to each other.
What attracted me most to the Way of Life was having gone through year one, knowing that people were willing to expose themselves vulnerably and honestly. I saw that there were no perfect people, and that gave me the confidence to go ahead and start Way of Life with people who were just mere acquaintances.
The greatest takeaway I had with Walking with Others is that God was already at work, and all of us are apprentices of God. And so in the Walking with Others, God talked to us about being attentive, whether it was walking in the same direction as somebody or being more intentional about getting closer with somebody and helping them mature to be more like Christ.
My greatest takeaway from Way of Life was a better understanding of myself and of God. And because of this understanding, I had more confidence. I could set boundaries that were safe for my family, my spiritual life, and for my relationships with others.
I think the major action point for me personally was the Saturday retreat at church. As I reflected on Psalm 139 and how much He loves me and how He made me, it was a game changer in my life.
I learned that sharing my story brings hope to others because it shows that healing can happen in those deep, wounded places of my heart.
God used the journey in my life to be more like Jesus and helped me become a better listener. I believe I've become more prayerfully conscious, and I actually have more empathy for people and the situations that they're going through.
God's timing is always amazing through the class in when I need it. And I had a couple friends that were going through some really tough times this year, and it just seemed that we'd be going through a lesson and it was exactly what I was doing with one of my friends. And I remember somebody calling me late one night when we were talking, and I just had to sit and listen, and all I could remember is that in our lesson it was just be still and listen. And it was interesting to see how those lessons really panned out in the different relationships that I was going through.
I feel that one of the ways that I've learned to be more like Jesus through way of life was understanding my need for rest. I am most rejuvenated when I spend time in God's Word, when I pray, when I listen to teachings, and when I'm engaged in praise and worship.
Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God created beforehand that we might walk in them." Some translations say we are his handiwork, or even we are his masterpiece. So here's to what may be your next step as you grow to be like Jesus here at Emmanuel.